December 1935. Oneida County, Wisconsin. 31 men doing iron ore survey work in pine country, 14 miles north of Rhinelander. Then the first tracks appeared, not bear, not wolf, something that walked on 2 legs, but was not a man. Something that left prints 18 inches long in frozen ground. Something that watched from the tree line before any of us thought to look. By the 3rd week, we knew it was hunting us. By the 4th week, we knew it was winning. This is what happened during the 31 days before the entire camp was abandoned, sealed by company order, and never reopened. Subscribe for more true historical horror stories. I arrived at Camp Weyerhaeuser No. 4 on the morning of December 3rd, 1935, aboard the back of a supply truck that had come up from Rhinelander along a logging road cut through second-growth pine. I was 22 years old, and I had been out of steady work for 14 months. The Milwaukee Unemployment Office had given me a slip of paper with an address and a company name. Northern Iron Survey Associates, and told me the rate was $1.80 a day plus bunk and meals. In December of 1935, $1.80 a day was enough to make you do things you'd later spend the rest of your life trying not to think about. The camp itself was smaller than I expected. 3 bunkhouses built from rough-cut lumber, a cookhouse, and a prefabricated equipment shed the company had hauled up in pieces that past September. The whole thing sat in a clearing not much bigger than 2 acres. The foreman, a heavy-set man, somewhere in his mid-50s, barrel-chested, with a jaw scar that ran from his left ear down to his collar, met me at the truck and shook my hand without much interest. He went by Breck. He told me the previous survey team had finished their rotation and gone back to Rhinelander. He said it matter-of-factly, the way a man does when he's been asked the same question enough times that he's polished the answer smooth. Later, I heard from one of the older hands that the previous team had left 3 days early, in the middle of the night, on foot. 2 of them had walked the 14 miles to Rhinelander rather than wait for the truck. Nobody in camp talked about it directly. The nearest telephone was at the Rhinelander Rail Depot. The nearest doctor was 12 miles south. Those were not unusual conditions in 1935, and nobody hired on expecting otherwise. The work was straightforward enough. We were running instrument surveys on a potential iron ore deposit the company geologists had identified from existing drill records. My job was rod man. Hold the leveling staff, move when directed, write numbers in the field book when called out. The work took you into the pine woods in teams of 3 or 4, and you were back in camp by 4 o'clock at the latest, because the light went fast in December that far north. We ate at 6, lights out at 9:30, back at it by 7 in the morning. There were 31 of us, counting Breck. I shared a bunkroom with 7 other men. The one I got to know best in those first days was a tall Norwegian fellow named Halvorsen, late 30s, quiet, angular face, hands like shovels. A man who'd grown up on a farm near Ashland and had hunted these woods since he was a boy. Halvorsen knew timber country. That mattered later. The other man I'll mention is Dempsey, who was about my age and had come up from Racine on the same company notice. Dempsey talked too much when he was nervous and laughed at things that weren't funny. I liked him anyway. He kept the evenings from feeling as long as they were. The first week passed without incident. The days were cold, temperatures dropping to 15 below zero by the second night. But the survey work went smoothly, and Breck ran a competent operation. The pine country out there was dense and old growth in places, trees that had been standing since before the logging companies came through in the 1880s. Some of those trees were 4 feet across at the base. Walking through that forest on survey days You got the feeling you were somewhere that didn't particularly notice you were there. The rules Breck gave us on the first day were practical. No one goes out after dark. No one leaves camp alone at any time. All survey teams check in when they return to the clearing. The company had had trouble with a worker breaking an ankle in rough terrain 2 seasons before, and the rules were framed around liability. We didn't question them. Nobody wanted to be alone in those woods, regardless. The first thing I noticed that I couldn't account for happened on December 8th, my 5th day at camp. Halvorsen and I were working a traverse line about 800 feet northeast of camp when we crossed a section of snow that had been, disturbed. That's the word I'd use. Disturbed. Not like an animal had passed through, more like something had stood in one place for a long time. The snow in that patch was packed down in a rough oval, maybe 3 feet across, and around the edges of the oval. The crust was broken and refrozen, like whatever made it had been there long enough for the surface to ice over. Halvorsen looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, it was probably a deer bed. I wrote it in my field notes because that's what rodmen do. We write everything down. That night at supper, I mentioned it to Breck, and he said the same thing. Deer bed. I believed them both, more or less. On December 11th, one of the survey teams working the Western Quadrant came back to camp 40 minutes early. The team leader was a compact, square-faced man named Kowalski, Polish fellow in his 40s, who'd been doing field survey work since 1920. Kowalski was not what you'd call an imaginative man. He documented things the way a machine might, and when he came back early, Breck noticed. Kowalski said they'd found tracks. He said they were in a dry creek bed about half a mile west of the Western Survey stake. Running north to south along the creek bed for approximately 60 yards before they angled up the bank and disappeared into the thicker timber. He said the prints were roughly 18 inches long, roughly 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot, and showed claw impressions at the toes. He said they were bipedal, 2-footed, with a stride length of approximately 52 inches. Breck said it was a bear. Walking on hind legs, confused by the cold or sick, Kowalski said he'd seen bear sign his whole working life, and this wasn't bear sign. He said it matter-of-factly, not arguing, just documenting. Then he went to supper. That night, I lay awake in the bunk room and listened to the pine trees move in the wind, which they do all night up there, and I thought about a stride of 52 inches. A tall man has a stride of maybe 30 inches at a fast walk. 52 inches is a running stride. Whatever made those tracks had been walking, not running, at 52 inches between footfalls. I wrote that in my own notebook, separate from the survey field book, and I did not sleep much that night, on December 14th, a Sunday which meant no survey work. Halvorsen went out to check rabbit snares he'd set along the south tree line, the closest edge of the forest to camp, maybe 300 feet from the bunkhouses. He was gone 40 minutes and came back with nothing. He told me, quiet enough that only I heard, that something had gotten to all 7 of his snares. Not just triggered them, that happened, rabbits got loose. But these hadn't been triggered in the normal way. The wire on each one had been pulled straight, not sprung, like something had found the snares and removed whatever was in them without triggering the mechanism, all 7 of them. Same way, he said he'd been snaring since he was 12. He said, an animal doesn't do that. I wrote it down. December 16th, Halvorsen's team ran a bearing line through a section of forest about 1,100 feet northwest of camp. The temperature that morning was 11 degrees. We worked until about 2 in the afternoon when the transit started giving us trouble with the cold, and Halvorsen called it. We were packing the equipment when Dempsey, who'd been clearing brush from the bearing line about 40 feet ahead, went very quiet. Then he said, in the most ordinary voice I've ever heard a frightened man use, "Something's watching us." I looked where he was looking. The tree line in that direction was heavy. Close-grown spruce mixed with the pine, the kind of thicket where the light just disappears about 20 feet in. I couldn't see anything. Halvorsen walked up beside me, and we stood there for what I would estimate was 2 minutes, not moving, not speaking, watching that tree line. Then, I saw it. Or rather, I saw where it was. About 8 feet off the ground, back in that darkness maybe 30 feet, there were 2 points of reflected light, like eyes catching what little afternoon sun was left. They were set wide apart, wider than a man's eyes, maybe 10 or 11 inches, and they were steady, not moving, just watching. Halvorsen said very quietly, "We're going back to camp. Don't run." We walked back. We didn't run. It took everything I had. We reported it to Breck. He said it was a wolf. He said wolves' eyes reflected light, and they sometimes stood up against trees. He said it was distance, distortion, and we'd probably been looking at 3 or 4 feet off the ground, not 8. He said it clearly, firmly, the way a man does when he's decided that the explanation he's giving is the one that will hold the camp together. I understood that. I didn't argue. That night, for the first time, something circled the camp. I know this because the dogs heard it. The camp kept 2 dogs, brown mixed-breed animals, working dogs that the cookhouse man used for company. Both of them started up at 10:30, not barking, which would have been normal, but a low, continuous sound from both of them at the same time. The kind of sound a dog makes when it is very frightened and has decided that making noise will make things worse. They faced the tree line and didn't look away for 2 hours. I lay on my cot and counted time. Other men were awake too. You could tell by the quality of the silence, the way a room full of sleeping men sounds different from a room full of men pretending to sleep. Nobody spoke. At approximately midnight, the dogs went quiet. Not calm quiet, just quiet. The next morning, one of them wouldn't eat. December 18th, Breck assembled the camp at the cookhouse before the morning work rotation. He didn't mention the dogs. He said the company had been notified of the track evidence and that a representative from the Wisconsin Conservation Department would be coming out to assess the situation. He said in the meantime all survey work would be conducted within 500 feet of camp. No exceptions. He paused and looked around the room in that way he had, not threatening, just making sure the words had landed. Then he said, "Any man who wants to take his pay and go back to Rhinelander can do that." No judgment. Nobody stood up. In December of 1935, $1.80 a day was $1.80 a day. The Conservation Department man never came. Work continued in the reduced zone through December 19th and 20th. On the evening of the 20th, Kowalski found something at the camp perimeter that he brought directly to Breck without telling anyone else first. I found out about it from Dempsey, who had been in the equipment shed and heard them talking through the wall. What Kowalski found was a pile. At the north edge of the clearing where the pine trees started, somebody, or something, had arranged a collection of animal remains. Clean bones, fur, what appeared to be several rabbits, and at least one larger animal, possibly a fox. The bones had been picked clean. They were stacked, not scattered, stacked with some intent that wasn't accidental. I want to be precise about this. Animals don't stack bones. They scatter them, they bury them, they chew them down. They don't arrange them at the edge of a camp in a way that faces the camp's primary entrance. This was placed to be found. Breck had the pile removed. He told Kowalski and the two men who eventually heard about it to keep it quiet. It stayed quiet for about 4 hours, which is how long it takes for information to move through a camp of 31 men when everyone already suspects something. December 21st was the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. We lost the sun by 2:45 in the afternoon. By 3:30 it was dark as midnight. That was the first night we heard the sound. I can describe it accurately because I have heard it in my memory every night for the past 47 years. So I have had considerable time to find the right words. It started at some distance. From the north, I believed, though sound does strange things in dense pine country. It was vocalizations. Not a howl, not a bark, not any animal call I had heard in Wisconsin or anywhere else. It was a series of sounds, low, then rising, then falling, that had the cadence of speech. Not words. I want to be clear. Not words that I could distinguish, but the rhythm of them, the rise and fall. The way one sound answered another from a slightly different direction. It had the quality of two things communicating. Two sources, maybe more. And it went on for some time, 30 minutes I estimated, maybe longer. In the morning, nobody talked about it at breakfast. Then Dempsey said, with that nervous laugh of his, "Anybody else hear that last night?" Every man in the room said yes. Breck said it was wolves. He said he'd heard wolf packs run calls back and forth between groups, and that was exactly what we'd heard. He said it with enough authority that about half the men visibly settled. Halvorsen looked at me from across the table and said nothing. That day, the 22nd, we did not go out to survey. Breck said it was equipment maintenance day. We all understood what it actually was. The men sharpened tools, repaired gear, did things that kept their hands busy. Nobody argued about staying in. The economy of fear had shifted from keeping men from leaving to keeping men from thinking too hard about what staying meant. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the clearing on the north side, where Kowalski had found the bone pile. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Breck had the remains cleared, but the ground still showed the disturbance where they'd been placed. And on the tree trunk nearest to where the pile had sat, a pine maybe 14 inches across, there were marks. Deep ones, cut into the bark starting at about chest height and running upward. But chest height for these marks was maybe 6 feet from the ground, and they ran upward from there another 3 feet at least, maybe more. Whatever made them had been standing at approximately 6 feet and reaching up to 9.5 feet, and scoring the wood with enough force to cut deep grooves in pine bark. I put my hand against the marks. My hand fit inside one groove with room to spare. I went back to the bunkhouse and wrote 3 pages in my notebook, and then I lay on my cot, and I thought about what it meant that something 9 feet tall had stood at the edge of our camp in the night, and marked the tree that faced our door. I thought about territory. I thought about what it means when something marks a boundary, and then I thought about which side of the boundary we were on. December 23rd. The Conservation Department man still had not come. Breck sent a man back to Rhinelander on foot with a written message to the company office. The man, Jennings, a wiry fellow from Kenosha, left at 7 in the morning and reached Rhinelander by early afternoon. He told us later that the company agent there had read the message, told him the conservation man had been delayed, and suggested the camp continue normal operations. That night, the sounds came again. Closer. I estimated 400 feet, maybe less. And this time there was a third source, southeast of the other two, so that if you mapped it in your head, the sounds were triangulating the camp. A pattern from 3 points, and we were inside the triangle. The dogs were not making any sound. They were simply, gone. Both chains were still attached to their stakes. Both collars were still on the chains. The dogs were not there. Breck knocked on every bunkroom door at 6 the next morning. December 24th, Christmas Eve. He stood in the doorway of our room and said, in a voice that was completely steady, "I'm asking every man in this camp to account for himself between 10 last night and 1 this morning." He went room to room and got 30 tallies of men who had been in their bunks, not sleeping, but in their bunks. The 31st was himself. The dogs were not found. No blood, no fur, no signs of a struggle. Whatever had those dogs had taken them whole, and without making enough noise to wake a single one who were already lying awake, listening. After the accounting, Breck called a meeting in the cookhouse. He stood at the head of the table, didn't sit, and looked down the room. Then he said a thing that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Whatever this is, it has had opportunities to act directly against this camp, and has not taken them. I do not know what that means. I am choosing to interpret it as tolerance, and I am choosing not to test that tolerance further than we already have." Then he said we would continue to a scheduled end date of December 31st, collect our pay, and leave in an orderly manner on the morning supply truck. No one spoke for a moment. Then Halvorsen said, "And the nights until then?" Breck said, "We stay inside. We keep lights burning. We don't go out after dark. We do not, under any circumstances, respond to sounds from the tree line." He looked down the table. "Any man who wants to leave before the 31st forfeits half his wages per company contract. I'm telling you that plainly so there's no misunderstanding later. 7 men chose to forfeit half their wages that afternoon. They walked out the same day, 14 miles to Rhinelander in temperatures of 9 degrees. 24 of us stayed. December 25, Christmas. The cookhouse man produced something approximating a proper meal from company stores. We ate it and were mostly quiet. Someone had a mouth organ and played a few songs that nobody sang along to. The day passed without incident. It almost felt like something had agreed to the holiday, which is not a thought I enjoy having. The nights between the 25th and the 29th were not peaceful, but they were endurable. The sounds continued each night, always after 10, always from multiple directions. On the 27th, there were sounds from the south as well, which meant all 4 compass points were represented, and whatever was out there had positioned itself around us completely. We heard movement near the equipment shed on the night of the 28th. Heavy, deliberate footsteps in the snow on the far side of the shed wall. 3 men who shared the bunk room closest to the shed heard it clearly enough to agree afterward on the timing. Approximately 11 minutes of slow pacing, then silence. In the morning, the snow at the northeast corner of the shed showed impressions, 2 of them clear enough to measure 18 inches long, claw marks at the toe ends. The stride between them was 48 inches. It had been standing there, waiting or watching, or both, and then it had gone back into the trees. Kowalski measured the impressions with his survey tape before breakfast and wrote the numbers in his field book. He was thorough the way he was always thorough. He didn't say anything about it at breakfast. He just sat down and ate his oatmeal and added the measurements to his notation from the creek bed 2 weeks earlier. December 29th was when I heard the voice. I need to be precise here. I know what I'm claiming. I have had 47 years to reconsider it, and I have not reconsidered it. I was awake at approximately 2 in the morning. The camp was quiet, or as quiet as it got those nights, which wasn't very. I was lying on my cot facing the wall when I heard, from somewhere north of the bunkhouse, a sound that was not a howl and was not an animal call. It was, and I will say this once and not repeat it, it was a word. Not a word I recognized. Not English, not anything I'd heard in English or Polish or Norwegian or any other language spoken in that camp, but it had the definitive shape of a word. One sound, one beat, decisive, spoken at a volume meant to carry, then silence. I did not move. I did not look out the window. I lay there with my heart making a great deal of noise, and I breathed very carefully until morning. At breakfast I asked Halvorsen quietly if he had heard anything in the night. He looked at me for a moment and said, yes. I asked him what it sounded like. He said, like something that knew we were listening. That was the last conversation I had in that camp that I'd call ordinary. December 30th, one day before the scheduled departure, Breck came to me in the early afternoon and said he wanted an extra man to help him make an inventory of the equipment shed for company records before departure. I said I'd help. We went to the shed together. Inside, the equipment was as it should have been. Survey transits in their cases, rod cases, pack frames, supply boxes along one wall. We were about 20 minutes into the count when Breck stopped at the back wall and stood very still. At the bottom of the back wall, which faced the pine forest, there was a hole. Not damage from rot or settling, the boards had been pushed inward from the outside, and the gap at the bottom was large enough to put your arm through. The edges of the boards were splintered outward on the interior, meaning the force had come from outside. And on the floor inside, in the fine sawdust and grit that accumulated there were marks, partial impressions, not full tracks, but the front portion of a foot, the ball and the toes. The claw impressions were deep enough to have scored the wood floor beneath the dust. Whatever had pushed through that gap had put its foot inside the shed, and then, for whatever reason, had not come in further. It had looked. I looked at Breck. He looked at the hole and the marks for a long time. Then he stood up and said, "Finish the count. We leave at 7 tomorrow morning." I'm moving the departure up by 2 hours. We did not discuss what we'd seen with the other men. There was no point. Everyone was going to be on that truck regardless. That final night, December 30th, was unlike the others. The sounds did not begin at 10. They began at dusk, 4:30 in the afternoon, while it was still technically the dinner hour. By 5 o'clock, every man in camp was in the cookhouse, which was the largest and most solid of the buildings. Breck did not order this. It just happened, the way groups of people move when they share a common understanding they haven't put into words. What was different that night was the silence between the sounds. The previous nights had been constant. Sounds, movement, the feeling of a perimeter being maintained. That last night was different. The sounds would come close, very close, directly outside the cookhouse walls at certain moments. And then there would be complete silence. Not the silence of something gone, the silence of something watching, deciding. At one point, close to 9 o'clock, I was seated at the end of the table nearest the north wall of the cookhouse when the wall flexed. Not much. A 1/4 inch, maybe less, as if something very heavy had leaned against it from outside. The planks groaned once. The lamp on the wall hook swung on its nail, and then it stopped. 24 men held their breath for what felt like a very long time. At midnight, the sounds stopped entirely. No gradual withdrawal, no distance progression. Just done. Halvorsen looked up at me and said, "It's done for tonight." I asked him how he knew. He said he didn't know anything. He said it felt like being dismissed. That is the best word for it. Dismissed. We left at 7 in the morning on December 31st, 1935. 24 men, 2 supply trucks, and Breck in the cab of the lead vehicle. We left everything that wasn't personal gear. The equipment, the supplies, 3 weeks of company investment in lumber and labor and materials, all of it stayed. Breck had radioed the company from Rhinelander the previous week and, as far as I knew, given them some version of events that did not include most of what I've written here. The 14 miles to Rhinelander took 2 hours on the frozen road, which was slower than usual because the road had drifted in places and the trucks had to work for it. I sat in the back of the second truck and watched the pine forest pass on both sides, and I did not look into the trees. Some of the other men did. Dempsey did, and I saw his face when he turned back around, and I didn't ask him what he saw. In Rhinelander, the company agent met us at the rail depot and took a head count. Breck gave him a written report. The report, I saw it briefly, though I had no reason to read it, described the camp's early closure as due to unsatisfactory geological conditions and adverse winter circumstances. That is, the official record, Camp Weyerhaeuser No. 4, was listed as inactive, then abandoned, then delisted from company assets within the following 18 months. No survey was ever completed, no ore extraction ever began. The men dispersed. Kowalski went back to Milwaukee. Dempsey got on a southbound train, and I never saw him again. Halvorsen shook my hand on the platform and said something I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "You understand it wasn't our camp?" I said I did. He said, "Good." Then he walked north on the main street, and I did not see which direction he turned. I took a bus to Eau Claire, got work at a machine shop, and I did not go back to northern Wisconsin for 11 years. When I did, I went in summer, and I didn't go near Oneida County. I'm 78 years old now. I live in La Crosse, down in the southwestern part of the state, close to the Mississippi, away from the pine country. I've had a reasonable life. I worked machines for 30 years, married well, raised 3 children who think their father is given to telling long stories that are probably exaggerated. Young people today don't believe this kind of account. I understand that. The world has been explained and mapped and photographed from satellites, and there is not supposed to be room in it for something that leaves 18-inch tracks and stands 9 feet tall and moves. Through old-growth pine like smoke moves through a keyhole. But the folklore of northern Wisconsin, if you take the time to look at it, has had a name for what was in those woods since before Europeans came through. The Dogman, some call it now. The stories go back past the logging era, past the fur trade. Algonquin accounts, documented by missionaries in the 1600s, describe something in the pine country that walked upright, marked territory, and responded to trespass. Every several years, a report surfaces from somewhere in the northern counties. Someone finds tracks. Someone comes out of the woods saying they saw something that wasn't a bear and wasn't a man. The reports get the same treatment ours got. Dismissed, minimized, filed under adverse conditions. The camp is gone now. Trees have taken back the clearing. The logging road closed over sometime in the 40s. In another generation, there will be no physical evidence that 31 men were ever there, or that 24 of them left earlier than planned on the last morning of 1935. That's fine. I don't need evidence. I have my notebook, and I have 47 years of waking at 2 in the morning and listening to whatever sound is outside, whether it's the Mississippi moving or the neighbor's dog or just the wind, and reminding myself that I am in La Crosse and the nearest pine country is a long way north. We left. It stayed. That's how these things end. The forest always wins.